We're continuing in our study on the history of the churches, and just to review a little bit, last week we were covering the Anglican Church, which is also known as the Episcopalian Church, and the Church of England, also known as, and that was founded as by King Henry VIII, who didn't really have much of a doctrinal issue with the Catholic Church. He simply didn't like that the Catholic Church would not give him a divorce or an annulment of his marriage, and so he didn't like that. So he decided, well, I'm going to start my own church, my own state-run church, and that will allow me to basically have my way with all my wives that I'm going to have. And I misspoke last week. I said he was married and divorced 6 times, but I think he killed at least one of his wives. So I don't think he was. He wasn't divorced 6 times, although unless that's your idea of divorcement. But King Henry VIII, he was not an upstanding man there, not an upstanding king, but that was the root. That was the founding of the Anglican Church, and today.
The Beatles had it wrong.
The what?
They sang, "I'm Henry VIII, I am. I've been married 7 times before."
Oh, well. I don't know. I didn't know those were bastions of historical accuracy when you have songs in pop culture. But anyway, however it may have been, he was married a lot of times, and a very immoral man. But and so today the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, is really, in doctrinal ways, they're not much different from the Catholic Church. What they did, they had their services in English instead of Latin. I believe that they were not for celibacy of the priesthood, and they're definitely much more liberal even than the Catholic Church. Very, very liberal. And you're not going to find, as a matter of fact, the Episcopal Church here in town has a labyrinth set up on their yard, in their courtyard area that they have, and labyrinth like that is completely New Age and occultish and mystical, and so I've seen someone walk through that and they do their little prayers or whatever without praying to God. They're looking within themselves and centering on themselves, and that's very New Age and occultic. Instead of just simply praying, directing prayers to God, it's a mystical type of thing, walking through that labyrinth. So, anyway, continuing at the Anglican Church, there was a bit of respite from the persecution that was taken, because Henry VIII, he had a bit of tolerance for the Protestants, but he was still a Catholic and at heart. But Edward had taken the throne, and he took it more of in a Protestant turn. But after Edward died, Henry's oldest daughter Mary ascended to the throne, who was very much a Catholic, very, very much hardcore Catholic, who hated Protestants, who also hated the Baptists that were there, and so she reigned only from 1553 to 1558, but she was very, very much a staunch Romanist, and through her ascension to the throne, Rome used her to reclaim its power over England. In November of 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived from Italy. This is a quote from the book Reform and Reformation by Elton. Quote, "with a commission to reconcile England to the papacy and to absolve it from the sin of schism." So they looked at England as having divided from their true church, so to speak. And so they're looking to reconcile England. And so by Mary, a staunch Romanist Catholic on the throne, they were able to try to do that. And so 4 years of torment followed for Protestant and Baptist after this took place, after the Catholic, that cardinal went there and they're trying to reclaim England. There was a lot of torment for Protestant and Baptist under Mary around 250 Protestants and Baptists were burned at the stake. Nearly 100 more people perished under torture and in prisons, and there were many, even those who didn't die in the prisons, in some ways probably wish they had died in the prisons because the conditions were so horrific in the prisons that they were thrown into. Hundreds of Bible believers were forced to flee Rome. Not forced to flee Rome, forced to flee England to Europe, to mainland Europe, because of the persecution going on. The rage of English Catholic authorities against the Bible during Mary's reign was such that even the scripture text painted on church walls were required to be removed. They just hated the Bible. And that was one of the characteristics of the persecution during the Dark Ages, during that Holy Roman Empire era, before the Protestant Reformation, was that they hated those who printed or translated the Scriptures, were trying to distribute the Scriptures, but they also then hated the Scriptures themselves, so they would try to stamp out whatever they could. John Rogers, a Bible translator, fell victim to Mary's fury in 1555. The bones of Rogers published the first complete Tyndale Bible called the Matthew's Bible because Thomas Matthew was his pen name and appeared on the title page. It's a very important figure in the history of Bible translation. And then the bones of Bible translators Paul Fagius and Martin Bucer were burned by Queen Mary. And so this wasn't the first time we've heard of bones being dug up, like John Wycliffe's bones. The Catholic Church had John Wycliffe's bones being dug up and burned. I mean, just as an extra, I guess, what's that? Assurance, yeah. You know, it's simply that there was such rage and hatred in their heart that they did such irrational things. And yeah, I mean, it's basically, well, we didn't get to kill him the first time, so we're gonna have the satisfaction of, we're gonna make sure we get to burn him, and that's what they did. I mean, just think of the hatred in the heart of the person, of people, to do such things. But that is what they did. And these translators, the translators' bones were burned by Queen Mary. They had been invited by Archbishop Cranmer to come to England and assume professorships at Cambridge. He desired that they revise the English Bible. This project was stopped due to sickness and death. And it's very important to point out that many of these Protestants who were burned by Queen Mary had supported the burning and persecution of Baptists. Some examples of that were Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, John Hooper, Nicholas Ridley, John Philpott, and John Rogers. They, at the time before England took a turn back toward the Catholic Church, they were in support of some of those Baptists who had been burned, and then they in turn were burned by the Catholics. So that's where it's important to distinguish. This is a history of the churches. This is a history of, and we're going to be getting into the history of the English Bible in future weeks. But this is a history, but not everything, just because the Protestants were persecuted by the Catholics doesn't mean the Protestants were exactly right in the way they handled things when they were in power. So it's important to keep that in perspective, that they persecuted the Baptists and they in turn were also persecuted by the Catholics. And what the common thread is between why would they do the persecuting? Because the Protestants held to the same belief, or most of the Protestants did, of a state church, a state-run church. And when you link church and state, you have big problems. Now, also, when you try to de-link God and churches from the state to a too great of extent, then you have what's going on in France right now, because they deal a lot with extreme Islam and a lot of violence. They've dealt with a lot of violence there. And so, and because of simply, if someone insults the Prophet Muhammad or draws a cartoon, there's been a lot of gruesome violence there. And so they actually have a bill that is being, I don't know if it's been passed or in the process of being passed through their, I think their parliament or whatever their governmental body is there, that's going to go too far in delinking the church and state, where it actually elevates the state above the church, particularly making sure everybody, like being ultra secular. So there's a difference between, let's say in America, we've had a good history of, as a country, recognizing the God of the Bible and still having God as part of the public square, in God we trust, just overall that it's been part of our nation for so long, without it being you are forced to believe in God, the God of the Bible. You are forced to believe in Jesus Christ. So today the forces are, back at this time, the forces were, we're going to use the state to enforce the religion. But in today's society, which we have now, there is going too far then, saying, well, separation of church and state means you can't even mention God. You can't even mention Jesus. And that's not what separation of church and state is. That separation of church and state was just simply meant to be that the church doesn't control the state and the state doesn't control the church, the churches. And so that there's not an actual official religion, and that people are not persecuted for believing something different, for having a different religion. And so if you look at the history of the American colonies, it was handled differently from colony to colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony did not have a history of religious freedom. Providence and Rhode Island, they had a history of religious freedom. William Penn, when he founded Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker, and he believed in religious tolerance, religious freedom. And so there were different colonies had it handled different ways. But then until we got our Bill of Rights and the Constitution, that First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law establishing, respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so that means a formal declaration of what an official religion is, but also it's not just a formal declaration, it is prohibiting the free exercise, that the right to worship, the right of religion is enshrined not only in the United States Constitution, but in the state constitutions as well. And in some ways, if you read the Massachusetts Constitution, it's almost even more detailed and explicit in the Massachusetts Constitution of the freedom of religion and worship. So now some of that still remains actually in the Constitution, is kind of harkens back also, some of the wording also harkens back to the days of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but very much the freedom of religion is enshrined there in the Massachusetts Constitution as well. But we do live in a day where that's increasingly under attack, where, oh yes, you can go to church, you can go worship, you have freedom to worship, but if you go, let's say for example, this baker in Colorado who had gone to the Supreme Court because the case had gone to the Supreme Court, and he won on a particular technical issue of the Human Rights Commission in Colorado. They were singling him out because of his religion. So that was the ruling, why they ruled in his favor, but they didn't give a blanket ruling that he was able to refuse customers based on his religious beliefs. But what happened was, right around that same time, apparently, of the Supreme Court, going to the Supreme Court, someone called him and said, could you make a cake that is, I forget if it was pink on the outside or blue on the inside, or blue on the inside and pink on the outside, to celebrate a gender transition. And they said no, they aren't going to make it. And the person right away said, well, I'm going to sue you then. And it was very clearly a target. So someone purposely targeted him, so he's back in court for that as well. But that is, now this isn't the way that a lot of people think these days, but if you truly believe in the First Amendment, that there should be no laws prohibiting the free exercise, if someone's asking me to do something that violates, as a business owner, if I'm asked to do something that violates my religious beliefs, I should have every right to refuse that. But that is not how a lot of the laws in the books are written today. because it's about equal opportunity and equal rights, non-discrimination, and all those kinds of things. But that's just as much an exercise of his religion. If he's violating his religious principles, that is an exercise of his religion by not making something that would go against his religion. And people would say, well, why doesn't he find another business? And well, where does it end? I mean, where does it end? There's no end to it. It doesn't matter if you're a photographer. It doesn't matter if you are if someone owns a farm where there's wedding ceremonies held. I mean, there's been all kinds of cases, and most of the time they lose. And they get fined large amounts of money because they're trying to stand for their religious beliefs. And the fact of the matter is, there's plenty of other bake shops that these people can call. They're just purposely singling out those to try to make life miserable for them. And that shows, that's also what we're seeing is the same intolerant attitude. It's taking a different form, but that's the same intolerant attitude of the state-run churches back in the days, the centuries in which we're looking at. That basically you can't believe anything else. And so today, there's this attitude, well, if you go against what the status quo is as far as the way our country's going and the way society's going, and you believe something different, we're going to try to stamp you out. We're going to try to, and the word today is cancel you. And that's a real thing. If the mob gets wind of some transgression, it's a real thing. But it's the same idea. It's the same intolerant spirit of persecution and control that was back at this time, just once again in a different form. Mary's last days were spent in torment. She was abandoned by her Spanish husband Philip, who shamed her with his public affection for other women. She was tormented with mental depression and fears. She thought that she was pregnant, but this was just her imagination. Quote from Freud in History of England, the impression grew daily that the queen had not been pregnant at all. From confidence, she fell into anxiety, from anxiety into fear, from fear into wildness and despondency. Her women now understood her condition. She was sick of a mortal disease, but they durst not tell her. Throughout May 1555, she remained in her apartments waiting in passionate restlessness. With stomach swollen and features shrunken, haggard, she would sit upon the floor and with her knees drawn up to her face in an agony of doubt and in mockery of her wretchedness. And so very, very sorry life that she ended up living as far as the end of her life. I mean, you think about that. If someone's as bitter and angry as she is, I mean, that's going to take a toll on your body. And who knows if that was connected, but it wouldn't be surprising. You got somebody who's living that kind of life under extreme stress and anger and hatred and then all the other things going on in her life. A very sad way to end. But she was definitely a wicked woman and was not on the throne long. Thinking that God was displeased with her, she wrote a letter to hasten the persecutions. And so why was God displeased with her? Well, her mind was, God's displeased with me because I haven't killed enough Protestants. We haven't gotten rid of enough of them. And that was the thinking. I mean, just completely deranged and crazy. Mary died on November 15th, 1558 at age 43. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended to the throne and brought relative peace to England. The Protestant character of the Church of England was restored under Elizabeth. She reigned from 1558 to 1603. And then James I took the throne after Elizabeth died. He reigned from 1603 to 1625. He was the king who authorized the King James Bible. And the Church of England persecuted dissidents from the time of its formation until the 17th century. And so that was the one common thread. They were still Baptist. Even when it took a more Protestant turn, it was still not friendly to the Anabaptists, the Baptist people. And so there was still persecution. And that's not the only problem of a state-run church, because number one, there's nothing in the Bible that speaks of a church as being linked with a government, other than the only time when there's going to be the theocracy and in its full form would be when you had the nation of Israel. That was directly commanded by God and led by God through his leaders. But the next time is going to be when Christ sets up his kingdom. He will do that. But it's not for any of us today to look to set up at the point of a sword or use the power of the government to try to establish a religion or persecute people. So there's freedom of conscience. There's the liberty to think and believe as one sees fit according to their own conscience. Now, we certainly are very strongly emphasize, well, you need to believe the Bible. You need to believe in Jesus Christ, but it's not for us to force someone else to do that. And so nothing about a state-run church in the Bible as far as in the history in which we live now in the New Testament churches. Nothing about that at all. And we're going to move on to the final group here that kind of comes toward the end of this Reformation period, but is related to the Church of England. And this was the Methodists. The Methodist denomination rose out of the Church of England in the 18th century. So we're really on the tail end of that Reformation era. This is kind of a outshoot of something during the Reformation time. It originated with the evangelistic ministry of two brothers, John and Charles Wesley. The Wesleys were members of a group of Oxford University students who were methodical in their habits of prayer and Bible reading and who sought to live simple, holy lives. And they were called Methodists as a derogatory term, just like the Anabaptists. They were called Anabaptists as a derogatory term by the Catholics and probably Protestants as well. Oh, those Baptists, those Anabaptists, they rebaptize people. Same thing with them. They were Methodists. Oh, you're Methodist, you're methodical, so methodical in your prayer and Bible reading and your emphasis on holy living. John Wesley was converted in 1738 while attending a church meeting in London. He had heard a reading of Luther's exposition on justification by faith from the book of Romans. Wesley would later write, "I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for my salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine." The Church of England barred the Wesleys from their churches, so they preached in homes, barns, streets, and fields. The Wesley brothers and George Whitefield became central figures in a great spiritual revival that occurred in England and America. Now, Wesleys were more instrumental in England, and then George Whitefield, he came to America. George Whitefield was a fellow Oxford graduate. The Wesleys were more active in England while Whitefield was active in America. So now Whitefield preached in New England. As a matter of fact, in a small town, I don't remember which town it is in Connecticut. I want to say it's Sharon, Connecticut, northwest Connecticut. There's a little, right in the center, just a little, I don't know if it's even big enough to call it, I think they call them the town green there in Connecticut. We call the common, but just a little spot there right in the middle of town, very small town. There's a rock there, and it has a little plaque on it that says that George Whitefield preached here, and a large crowd assembled. And the text of his message was, "You must be born again." And he was known for having a very loud voice, projected very far. People would have no trouble hearing him. He also was instrumental in starting a church over in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And he's actually buried there, and I can't remember now what the name of the church is, but I've actually seen it right under the pulpit. Down in the basement, there's a crypt where he's buried, and then there's a Bible there, and it's got a skull on top, which isn't his full skull, but from what I understand, there may be actually pieces of him. I'm not sure. Some of that might be him. But anyway, there's a crypt underneath, so when you're standing at the pulpit, you actually have George Whitefield's bones underneath you when you're up there. And then another fascinating feature about that church was that there was a bell at top that was made by Paul Revere, and they still have the original bill of sale there in that church building. So interesting that there. But he also, a lot of his converts actually ended up becoming Baptists, and even so much so that he said, "All my chickens have turned to ducks." And so I don't know, he wasn't necessarily thrilled with that, but that's what happened. People heard, so God used George Whitefield to preach the gospel, but then there were other things that happened after that people realized, they had scriptural baptism, believers' baptism. They ended up, not all of them, but a number of them became Baptists. And the movement grew so much that John Wesley wrote a set of general rules for his new denomination. He was originally intending to keep this movement within the Church of England, but at the same time, that's why you consider them a reformer. They're trying to reform. They weren't necessarily trying to reform the Catholic Church in this case. They were trying to reform the Church of England to a certain degree. And so, but eventually it got so big and so popular, and of course he wasn't necessarily on good terms with the Church of England, that he ended up writing a set of general rules. Now these rules were called, and during this time the animosity of the Church of England increased toward him, and these rules were called the Articles of Religion. They're in 1739 and are still used by many Methodists. And this was an abridgment of the 39 Articles of the Church of England, but it removed the Calvinist parts because John Wesley was not a Calvinist. And he was what we call today an Arminian. And we've talked about that in the last few weeks, the difference between Calvinism, Arminianism, and then if you actually just want to believe the Bible, it's better just to believe the Bible than to call yourself one of those things, because there may be elements of truth in each one. And but he removed the Calvinist parts, and one of the things he also believed was that is still taught in particularly the... I'll get to that in just a little bit, but I'll come back there. Methodism spread rapidly to America, and the first Methodist society was organized in 1766, and the Methodist churches were set up in 1784 as the Methodist Episcopal Church, showing that it came from the Episcopal Church. They also had an Episcopal setup as far as their church government. The Wesleys were prolific writers. John wrote over 50 books, and Charles wrote over 7,000 hymns and poems. And I forgot. I'm going to go back here because somewhere I thought I typed out. Maybe I didn't. All right. I was typing out some of the hymns that Charles Wesley wrote. Oh, here we go. I missed this part. John was the preacher. When they would preach in barns and homes, barns, streets, and fields, John typically preached, although Charles did it sometimes, but Charles was definitely more of a hymn writer. He wrote the words of the hymns, "And can it be, Christ the Lord is risen today. Come thou long expected Jesus, hark the herald angels sing. Love divine, all loves excelling," which we will actually sing that in the morning service today. And many more, but those are some of his famous ones. So they were prolific writers. Charles wrote over 7,000 hymns and poems. Significant social change followed the Methodist preaching. They established hospitals, the result was the establishment of hospitals, the closing of liquor establishments. As a matter of fact, in Ocean City, New Jersey, that was settled by the Methodists. There used to be Methodist camps there and everything. And they don't, to this day, from my understanding, unless they've changed it in the last few years, they until at least recently, or maybe it's still this way, it's a dry town. They don't sell alcohol in that town. And that is because of the heritage of the Methodists who settled there. Now, there are some, I think there's a push to try to get that in there. So if it hasn't changed, I haven't looked this up lately, but a few years ago we were there with a pastor, some other people. They took us on an outing we were there at a church for a missions conference in southern New Jersey, and then we had a day or a night where we went to to Ocean City, and there's a boardwalk there. So no alcohol anywhere around there in that place, because of, once again, the Methodist influence. But makes a big difference when you have and that's the thing, is when there is biblical preaching about holiness, preaching the gospel, and it's there's widespread acceptance, is going to result in social change. And many times there's Christians who are focused on the social change and at the same time neglecting the fact that the social change always has to come through Bible preaching and the hearts of the people being changed, because we get a society that the people are. The society we have is a reflection of what the people are like in a large part. Not everybody, of course, but the bulk of people. If you had a widespread acceptance of biblical preaching, there'd be a whole lot of changes that would take place in our country. Now, also, but some who are more, some of the places that are more liberal in their lifestyles in other countries, they look at America still as being a little bit, prude and stodgy, and it's, although, and we would sit here and say, well, no, look how far America's gone. Well, actually, in other countries, they've even gone farther in their ungodliness and immorality, as hard as that is to believe. But America, though, and I should say maybe public immorality. In America, there's been a lot of things done through the media, through Hollywood, and things done for many years. It's just absolute wickedness. But the social change included the establishment of hospitals, the closing of liquor establishments. They advocated for the humane treatment of prisoners, the abolition of slavery, and the establishment of workers' rights. Their circuit-riding preachers played a key role in Methodism's growth in America's frontier as it expanded westward. Probably one of the most famous circuit-riding preachers was Peter Cartwright. He preached thousands of times in his 60 years of ministry. And from what I read about him, he was definitely a very loyal Methodist. He hated any other denomination or type of church. But he was a well-known circuit-riding preacher. The camp meeting played a prominent role in the 1800s. This was just a time they'd get together, focus on singing and real energetic preaching, and just I think today now it's more of in America at least, it's more of the independent Baptists who some places do the camp meetings and that type of event. The Methodists follow an Episcopal form of government, which means rule by bishops over multiple churches. Once again, that's not a scriptural setup as far as the churches. God's Word and New Testament churches, they're always local churches that are self-governing churches. Now, there are times when a church might need assistance from another church, where a church comes alongside and helps guide that church through a transitionary period, or there are times when they you maybe go to another church. Maybe one pastor will talk to another pastor, or some pastors they'll go to another church for some guidance of, okay, we have this issue, which we see that in the book of Acts. They did that. They'd go back to the church at Antioch. There was a controversy that arose, and particularly people coming from Judea and teaching, well, those Gentiles need to be circumcised. So what did they do? They went back to the church in Jerusalem, talked to the apostles there, the leadership there, and they got some instruction, some direction on that. That didn't mean that the church in Jerusalem ruled over that church. It just meant there was an issue that came up they had to address. And so there's nothing of a hierarchical control over multiple churches. In the Methodist denomination, local churches do not have final control over their pulpits, as the pastors are appointed by the hierarchy, and the denominations typically own the properties. And it's very important to distinguish between the old-time Methodists. They're old-time Methodists, even though that some of their core doctrine, they retained some of the unbiblical ideas of, particularly they still baptized infants. And so some of those things they did retain, what was retained in the Church of England. There were many old-time Methodists who truly believed the gospel and they preached the gospel. But still the root of that denomination was one that was based on a faulty foundation, I guess you could say, with some of their core doctrines. And as I said, the one main distinguishing between the the Methodists in the Church of England was that they took out the Calvinist parts, and the Methodists, historically, the Wesleys, believed in free will to the extent of you could lose your salvation or stop believing in Jesus and not be saved anymore. And then the other aspect of that was, but they also then would believe that you could reach a state of entire sanctification. In other words, like there's a, and it's kind of hard to. I don't know that they would say that you stop sinning, but it is kind of a form of sinless perfectionism teaching. What's that?
Like the Pope.
Like the Pope. Well, maybe, I don't know. I don't know if that teaching's related to the Pope at all. But this is for not just a higher person. This was for just anybody who, and that is actually still a root doctrine today in the more conservative Methodist and Wesleyan. When I say conservative, those that are more traditional in their Wesleyan teachings, because in the area where I grew up, there's a movement, I guess you could say, called the Holiness Movement. And this is going to get into, I don't have these notes here as far as it's, but there was the Keswick Convention, the Keswick Doctrine, and this Holiness Movement kind of came out of that, and maybe branched off into different directions. But they believe in some form of entire sanctification. Also, definitely you can lose your salvation, but they're very, very much focused on holy living, and that's why they're called the holiness people. So I have family members who have attended a holiness church, but their doctrine is actually called Wesleyan Methodist. So there's different branches of what you would consider Methodism today and Wesleyanism, and they would be Wesleyan Methodists. And the women wear they're not Amish, they're not Mennonite, but the women don't. They let their hair grow out. They pile their hair up on top of their head and let their hair grow out. And then there was some, they were forbidden, depending on how the church handled it. I don't think they do this anymore, but some churches would forbid their church members from having televisions and things like that. So very, very much high standards of living, but at the same time still believing that it was possible to walk away from your faith, but then also that aspect of entire sanctification. I've talked to a family member about this before, about the sanctification part, and while I believe in principle in the idea of sanctification, there's not an actual eradication of your sin nature. Because while we're still in this flesh, while we're still at home in our bodies, we still deal with the lusts of the flesh, the lusts of the eyes, the pride of life. We still deal with the temptations. And so, yes, while God wants us to, we should be becoming more sanctified as we are living the Christian life. But it's not for the purpose of, I need to reach that height of entire sanctification. We're only going to be perfected when we're with the Lord. When we leave this body and we're with the Lord, that's when we'll be completely perfected. So it's a good intention. And so in a lot of the aspects of holy living, I'm all for the Wesleyan Methodist emphasis on holy living. And as a matter of fact, that church, it's a pretty large church right near my hometown. Or maybe a little ways away. I have family in that county, in that area. And they have some pretty strong preaching, some very sound Bible preaching, but some of the core root doctrines are still important as far as the disagreement of some of those key things. But that leads me to, there are many different Methodist groups with varying beliefs and practices. And today the United Methodist Church is the largest. It is also the most liberal as far as their morals and as far as what they stand for. Oftentimes, United Methodist Church, they're okay with gay marriage and homosexuality. But there is a division in the United Methodist denomination where they're actually on the verge of a split over the issue of homosexuality. Because a couple of years ago, they were trying to decide at their General Assembly or their convention whether they were going to, and by the way, they also have female pastors and those types of things, which the Bible doesn't. The Bible says a man should be the pastor of the church. But anyway, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was, are we going to endorse gay marriage, and are we going to be okay with LGBT bishops and ministers? It actually got voted down, I believe, barely. But it was not because of the American Methodist churches. It was actually in other parts of the world, especially in Africa. There's still the African Methodists, the Methodist churches in Africa are actually more conservative on that issue. I'm not saying they're better on their doctrine in other areas, but they're more conservative on that issue. And so there's a split, and so there is actually going to be a now I don't even remember what the name of the church. They're going to make a new denomination. I believe it's called the Global Methodist Church, I want to say. They've actually got a website and everything, but there's not going to be anything finally decided until the convention, their General Assembly or their convention, whatever they call it, next year, next fall. So it's going to be about a year and a half until anything even happens. But they are preparing. The Methodist denomination, United Methodist Church denomination, is looking to, perhaps there's going to be a split there in the very near future. Already there's not agreement on that particular issue. I mean, there's still the other doctrinal issues like infant baptism and other areas, but that's the one big issue that was in controversy. The Southern Methodist Church is definitely more conservative and more traditional in their doctrine. If you were to look at and I don't know how many churches that consists of, but it's more in the South. If you were to look at their doctrinal statement, it would be right in line with Wesley's 25 points there, his articles, 25 articles. So they're definitely more traditional in their doctrine as Methodists. The other thing, there's also the African Methodist Episcopal churches, AME, which is African, predominantly black. And oftentimes those now are mostly involved in a lot of social justice type of things, not so much Bible doctrine. But and then the Wesleyans, there is a separate Wesleyan denomination. There's also Church of the Nazarene. And I will say that some of these are more, if you want to say, closer to evangelical type churches, that they might not do infant baptisms, so there is some variation, but they have a root in going back to the Methodists, the Wesleys, and then, as I already mentioned, the Wesleyan Methodists. So that's going to be the end today for. We're stopping with the Methodists here. That's the last denomination we're necessarily going to look at this point. Eventually we'll get into a bit more of the Anabaptists and things, but for right now, that's where we're going to stop with the Protestant Reformation and some of these Reformation groups that came out during that particular time period.